It wasn't the empty kind that had followed him through his apartment for months. The silence was alive. It carried the rustling of tall oak trees, the distant chirping of birds, and the soft hum of insects hidden among wildflowers. It wrapped around Grandpa Walter's farmhouse like a warm blanket, inviting tired hearts to rest. Rowan stood beside his dusty car, taking a slow breath. The air smelled of fresh-cut hay and pine. Somewhere beyond the weathered red barn, a rooster crowed as if announcing the beginning of something new. That's because someone has to. Rowan. Their handshake lasted only a moment. Still, something about Mason's steady eyes caught Rowan off guard. There was kindness there. Not the loud kind that demanded attention. The quiet kind that stayed. "So," Mason said, lifting the toolbox. "Ready to wrestle with 40-year-old fence posts?" Rowan laughed. "I've never repaired a fence before." "Perfect." Mason smiled. "That means you haven't learned the wrong way yet." The morning slipped by with steady work. Mason explained each step patiently, never making Rowan feel inexperienced. When Rowan accidentally bent a nail sideways, he groaned in frustration. "I think I'm making things worse." Mason examined the crooked board before smiling. "No." He pulled another nail from his pocket. "You're learning." There wasn't a trace of judgment in his voice, only encouragement. As the sun climbed higher, Walter called them inside for lunch. The three of them gathered around the old oak table, sharing homemade soup and fresh bread. Conversation flowed naturally. Walter told stories about the farm. Mason teased him about refusing to replace the ancient tractor. Rowan found himself laughing more than he had in months. Later that afternoon, while carrying lumber toward the barn, Rowan noticed Mason quietly helping Walter climb a short ladder. He didn't draw attention to it. He simply stood nearby until Walter reached the top safely. Small moments like that revealed a great deal about a person. By sunset, the fence stood straighter than it had that morning. Summer work kept them busy. Some days they repaired old fences stretching across the western fields. Other days they painted the barn, stacked firewood, or cleaned years of forgotten tools from the workshop. Mason never hurried. He believed every job deserved patience. "If you rush," he often said, "you'll only have to do it twice." Rowan laughed every time he heard it. "You've definitely said that before. 100 times. And you'll probably say it another 100. Mason grinned. "Probably." Those little conversations slowly filled the empty spaces Rowan had carried inside himself. Without realizing it, he was smiling again. One afternoon, rain interrupted their work. Heavy drops drummed against the roof of the old barn while lightning flashed beyond the fields. Walter had gone inside hours earlier, leaving Rowan and Mason waiting for the storm to pass. The barn smelled of fresh wood and rain-soaked earth. Neither seemed eager to leave. Mason sat on an overturned bucket, watching the rain. "I used to love storms when I was a kid." "Really?" Rowan asked. "They made the world slow down." "No." Rowan looked around the quiet barn. "This feeling." Mason understood. "No one's asking us to be anyone else." The words stayed with Rowan long after the storm ended. Weeks passed. Their friendship became effortless. Some evenings they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and violet. Other nights they walked along quiet country roads where fireflies floated above the tall grass. They talked about childhood dreams, favorite books, old regrets, future hopes. Nothing felt forced. Neither tried to impress the other. They simply listened. For Rowan, that was something rare. Walter noticed the change. One evening he watched them laughing together while repairing an old swing beneath the oak tree. A gentle smile crossed his face. "They've brought life back to this place," he whispered. Then his smile faded slightly. A memory surfaced, one he had spent years trying to forget. He quietly turned away before either young man noticed the sadness in his eyes. The annual Harvest Festival arrived during the final weekend of August. For generations, the entire town had gathered there. Lanterns hung between trees. Children chased one another across open fields. Local musicians filled the warm evening air with gentle melodies. The smell of fresh bread, roasted corn, cinnamon, and apple pie drifted through every corner of the fairgrounds. Walter encouraged them to enjoy themselves. I'm old enough to know when my feet have had enough excitement. He smiled warmly. I'll head home early. Rowan and Mason spent hours wandering through the festival. They sampled homemade desserts, watched local artists carve wooden sculptures, played simple carnival games neither managed to win. At one booth, Rowan finally succeeded in tossing a ring over a glass bottle. The prize was a small stuffed fox. He handed it to Mason. You won it, Mason said. So? You should keep it. Rowan shook his head. I think it looks happier with you. Mason smiled with quiet gratitude. I'll hold you to that. As darkness settled across the fields, fireworks lit the sky with brilliant colors. The crowd cheered. Rowan and Mason stood side by side, looking upward. Without thinking, their shoulders brushed. Neither stepped away. Instead, they stayed exactly where they were, comfortably close. When the festival ended, they chose to walk home beneath the stars instead of driving. The country road was almost empty. Only the sound of crickets and distant owls accompanied them. After several minutes, Mason slowed his pace. Can I ask you something? Rowan looked over. Anything. Mason took a slow breath. When you first arrived here, he hesitated. You looked like someone carrying the weight of the world. Rowan smiled sadly. I probably was. And now? Rowan looked toward the farmhouse glowing softly in the distance. Now it feels lighter. Mason's eyes softened. I'm glad. Another quiet silence settled between them. This one felt different, hopeful. They stopped beneath the old oak tree near the farmhouse gate. Moonlight filtered gently through the branches. Mason looked at Rowan with a mixture of uncertainty and honesty. I don't know what tomorrow brings. He smiled faintly. But meeting you has been the best part of my summer. Rowan felt his heartbeat quicken. I was thinking the same thing. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Mason slowly reached for Rowan's hand. Their fingers met naturally. No words. No promises. Only quiet understanding. As they stood beneath the stars, Grandpa Walter stepped onto the porch to switch off the outside light. His eyes drifted toward the gate. He saw the two young men standing together. He noticed the warmth in their expressions. He paused. His face became unreadable. Without saying a single word, he quietly returned inside the farmhouse. Neither Rowan nor Mason realized they had been seen. Not yet. But by morning, the silence waiting inside the house would feel very different. When breakfast ended, Walter simply picked up his hat. We should finish repairing the north fence today. I'll grab my tools, Rowan replied. Walter nodded and stepped outside. The conversation lasted less than a minute. It somehow felt much longer. Mason arrived a few minutes later. His usual smile appeared as he climbed from the truck, but it faded the moment he noticed the mood around the farmhouse. Everything okay? He asked quietly. Rowan forced a small smile. I hope so. The three of them worked together through the morning. Hammer strikes echoed across the pasture. Wood creaked. The wind carried the scent of fresh-cut cedar. Walter spoke only when discussing the work. Nothing more. Around noon, he returned to the farmhouse to prepare lunch, leaving Rowan and Mason alone beside the unfinished fence. For several minutes, neither of them said anything. Finally, Mason leaned against a fence post. You've hardly looked at me all day. Rowan sighed. I don't know what to do. You don't have to solve everything today. What if I've hurt the one person who's always stood beside me? Mason looked across the field toward the farmhouse. I don't think your grandfather stopped loving you overnight. Rowan looked down. It doesn't feel that simple. Mason stepped closer. Whatever happens, you don't have to face it alone. Those words should have comforted Rowan. Instead, they filled him with guilt. The more he cared about Mason, the more afraid he became of losing his grandfather. That afternoon, Rowan walked into town to clear his thoughts. Main Street was busy with people enjoying the warm weather. As he passed the small grocery store, He overheard two neighbors talking quietly. "I saw them together at the festival." "So did I." "I feel sorry for Walter." Neither person noticed Rowan standing nearby. He kept walking. Their words followed him anyway. By the time he returned to the farmhouse, his shoulders felt heavier than ever. Over the next several days, Rowan began creating distance. He stayed inside after dinner instead of joining Mason on evening walks. He found extra chores whenever Mason suggested sitting on the porch. When Mason invited him to the lake one afternoon, Rowan politely declined. "I've still got work to finish." Mason nodded. "Maybe tomorrow." Maybe. Tomorrow came. Rowan found another excuse. Each small decision built another brick in the wall growing between them. Mason noticed. One evening, he stood alone beside the old oak tree where they had shared so many conversations. Rowan watched from his bedroom window but couldn't bring himself to walk outside. Fear had become louder than hope. Walter noticed everything. Late that night, he found Rowan sitting alone on the porch. Walter lowered himself carefully into the chair beside Rowan. "You've been carrying something heavy." Rowan looked toward the dark fields. "I don't want to lose my family." Walter's expression softened. "You won't." Rowan turned toward him. "Then why has everything changed?" Walter was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "Sometimes silence doesn't mean disappointment. It means someone is trying to find the courage to tell a story they've hidden for many years." Before Rowan could ask what he meant, Walter stood. "Come with me tomorrow morning." "Where?" "There's somewhere I should have taken you a long time ago." He rested a gentle hand on Rowan's shoulder. "I think it's finally time you understood why I was so quiet." Near the wall sat an old cedar chest. Walter walked toward it slowly. "I've avoided this place for almost 30 years. He rested his hand on the worn lid before lifting it carefully. Inside lay neatly tied bundles of letters, faded photographs, and a weathered leather journal. Walter picked up one photograph and handed it to Rowan. The picture showed a young Walter standing beside another young man, both smiling as they held fishing rods on the very dock outside. "He looks happy," Rowan said. Walter nodded. "I was." He paused. His name was Daniel Mercer. Rowan looked at the photograph again. "Was he your best friend?" Walter smiled gently. "He was much more important than that." The room became very still. Walter sat in the old rocking chair and looked toward the lake through the window. "We met when we were about your age." Daniel had a way of making ordinary days feel unforgettable. He believed every problem had an answer and every broken thing deserved another chance. A quiet laugh escaped him. "He even convinced me I could build this cabin." Rowan smiled. "I'm guessing he was right." Walter nodded. "Mostly." For a few moments, the memories brought warmth to his face. Then his expression changed. "The world wasn't very kind back then." He folded his hands together. "People learned to hide parts of themselves because they believed honesty would cost them everything." Rowan listened without interrupting. "I was afraid." Walter's voice had become little more than a whisper. "Afraid of disappointing my parents. Afraid of losing friends. Afraid of what the town would think. So I convinced myself that walking away would protect everyone." He looked down at the faded photograph. "It didn't." Walter carefully untied one bundle of letters. The paper had yellowed with age. He unfolded the first page and smiled sadly. "Daniel wrote to me after he left town." Rowan watched his grandfather's hands tremble. "He asked me to join him." Walter swallowed. "He said we could build a new life somewhere no one knew us." "What did you do?" Rowan asked quietly. Walter closed his eyes. "Nothing." The answer hung heavily in the room. "I kept telling myself I'd answer tomorrow. Then next week. Then next month." His voice broke. But tomorrow became years. Walter handed Rowan the final letter. Near the bottom of the page, one sentence stood alone. "I hope one day you choose hope instead of fear." A tear rolled down Walter's cheek. I never saw Daniel again. Silence filled the cabin. Not empty silence. the kind filled with memories that had waited decades to be spoken aloud. Rowan stepped forward and gently embraced his grandfather. Walter hesitated only for a heartbeat before returning the hug. For the first time in many years, the weight he had carried alone began to feel lighter. When they stepped apart, Walter placed both hands on Rowan's shoulders. "I need you to understand something." Rowan nodded. "The night I saw you and Mason together, I wasn't disappointed." His eyes filled with tears once more. "I saw two good people who cared deeply about each other. And I realized my silence was beginning to sound exactly like the silence that changed my own life." Rowan felt his own tears falling freely. "I thought I had lost you." Walter shook his head. "You could never lose me. I only needed the courage to face my past before I could help you protect your future." Outside, the clouds slowly parted. A ribbon of sunlight stretched across the calm lake. Walter smiled. "I don't want you to spend 50 years wondering what might have been." The drive home felt different. The silence was gone. It had been replaced by understanding. But as they turned into the farmhouse driveway, Rowan's heart suddenly stopped. Mason's blue pickup was parked outside his small house. Cardboard boxes filled the truck bed. A moving van waited by the road. Mason carried the last box toward the truck. He looked up as Rowan climbed out of Grandpa's pickup. Their eyes met across the yard. Mason offered a small, tired smile. "I thought you made your choice," he said quietly. "My new job starts tomorrow." The words struck Rowan harder than he expected. He had finally found the truth about his grandfather. Now he might lose the person he had hoped to share that truth with. "Mason!" Rowan barely remembered crossing the yard. His boots slipped on the gravel as he hurried toward the moving truck. His heart pounded so loudly that it drowned out the rumble of the engine. Mason turned around slowly. The small smile on his face carried more sadness than happiness. "I was hoping I'd see you before I left," he said quietly. Rowan stopped only a few feet away, trying to catch his breath. "Please, don't go." "Not yet." Mason looked at the packed boxes in the truck. "It wasn't you. It was my fear." For several moments, neither of them spoke. The autumn wind carried dry leaves across the driveway. "I kept thinking," Rowan continued, "that if I stayed close to you, I'd lose the only family I've ever had." Mason lowered his eyes. "And every time you pulled away," he paused, "I thought you were telling me goodbye. I never wanted to say goodbye." Rowan's voice trembled. "I just didn't know how to hold on to everyone I loved at the same time." Mason studied Rowan's face. For the first time in days, he saw honesty instead of uncertainty. "What changed?" Rowan smiled through tears. "My grandfather." Mason looked surprised. "He took me somewhere this morning. To an old cabin by the lake." Rowan told him about Daniel. About the faded letters. About the life Grandpa Walter had once imagined but never had the courage to choose. He spoke of the regret Walter had carried for nearly 50 years. When he finished, Mason remained silent for a long time. Finally, he asked softly, "He told you all of that?" Rowan nodded. "He said he doesn't want fear to decide another family's future." Mason looked toward the farmhouse. His eyes grew misty. "I judged him too quickly." "So did I." The screen door opened. Grandpa Walter stepped onto the porch. He walked toward them slowly, carrying the old photograph of himself and Daniel. When he reached Mason, he offered it with gentle hands. "I'd like you to have this." Mason looked surprised. "I couldn't." "I insist." Mason accepted the photograph carefully. Walter smiled. "That picture reminds me that love should never be remembered only through regret." He looked at Rowan. "I've spent years wishing I had one more chance to choose courage." Then he turned back to Mason. "I hope the two of you never spend your lives asking what if." The words settled gently over the quiet yard. No speeches. No dramatic promises. Only truth. Mason glanced toward the moving truck. Then toward the farmhouse. Finally, he smiled. "I suppose someone should tell the moving company they're making an unnecessary trip." Walter laughed warmly. "I was hoping you'd say that." Within an hour, the boxes were carried back inside Mason's little house. The moving truck disappeared down the road. As its engine faded into the distance, Rowan felt something else disappear as well. Fear. Not completely, but enough that hope could finally take its place. Life did not become perfect overnight. Some people in town still whispered. Others avoided asking questions altogether. Rowan learned something important. Not everyone would understand. And that was all right. The opinions of strangers no longer carried the same weight they once had. The people who truly mattered were already standing beside him. Sunday evenings slowly became a tradition. Grandpa Walter insisted everyone gather for dinner. Sometimes they shared homemade stew. Sometimes roast chicken. Sometimes breakfast for dinner because Walter claimed pancakes tasted better after sunset. The conversations wandered from gardening to old stories and future plans. Laughter returned to the farmhouse. So did music. One evening, Walter found an old record player in the attic. The three of them spent hours listening to songs from decades earlier. Walter smiled at one melody in particular. Daniel loved this song. The room grew quiet. Not because anyone felt uncomfortable. Because memories had become something they could finally share instead of hide. Winter arrived gently. Snow covered the fields surrounding the farmhouse. The fences they had repaired together stood strong against the cold winds. One snowy morning, Rowan looked out the kitchen window. Mason was helping Walter shovel the front walkway. Walter paused to catch his breath. Mason quietly took the heavier shovel without being asked. Watching them together filled Rowan with quiet gratitude. Family, he realized, wasn't only about the people life gave you. It was also about the people who chose to stay. On Christmas Eve, the farmhouse glowed with warm lights visible from the road. Neighbors stopped by with homemade pies and holiday wishes. Some who had once kept their distance now smiled warmly. Time, patience, and kindness had softened hearts that fear never could. After dinner, Walter handed Rowan a small wrapped box. Inside rested an old brass key. "The cabin?" Rowan asked. Walter nodded. "It belongs to you now." Rowan looked up. "I don't know what to say." Walter smiled. "Fill it with memories that don't end in regret." Later that night, Rowan and Mason stood together on the porch as snowflakes drifted quietly beneath the stars. The farmhouse behind them glowed with warmth. Inside, Grandpa Walter sat by the fireplace, peacefully reading one of Daniel's old letters. Not with sorrow anymore, but with gratitude for the love that had shaped his life. Rowan slipped the brass key safely into his pocket. He looked toward Mason and smiled. "We still don't know what the future looks like." Mason gently squeezed his hand. "We don't have to. As long as we face it together." Rowan looked across the snow-covered fields. For so long, he had searched for a place where he belonged. He finally understood the answer. Home had never been a building. Home was the people who chose one another, day after day, through fear, through hope, through every changing season. And for the first time in his life, Rowan no longer wondered where he belonged. He was already there. Spring arrived quietly, almost as if the countryside had decided not to rush the changing season. The snow melted into clear streams that wound through the fields, and tiny green shoots pushed their way through the soil. Birds returned to the old oak tree outside the farmhouse, filling each morning with cheerful songs. Rowan stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the hills in soft shades of gold. A year ago, mornings had felt heavy. Now they felt full of possibility. The screen door opened behind him. Mason stepped outside, carrying a second mug. "I knew you'd be out here," he said with a smile. "You know me too well. I've had practice." They laughed quietly. Some things had changed over the past few months. Many things had stayed exactly the same. They still watched the sunrise together whenever they could. They still worked side by side on the farm. They still found comfort in long conversations that didn't need dramatic words. Love, Rowan had learned, often grew strongest in ordinary moments. Grandpa Walter was already in the garden by the time they finished breakfast. He was kneeling beside a row of tomato plants, carefully pressing fresh soil around their roots. "I told you I'd finish that," Rowan called. Walter looked up with a grin. "And I told you I still remember how." Mason chuckled. He's as stubborn as ever. Walter laughed. I prefer the word determined. The three of them spent the morning planting vegetables, repairing flower beds, and preparing the farm for another summer. Neighbors occasionally stopped by to wave. Some stayed for a short conversation. Others brought homemade bread or fresh fruit from their own gardens. The whispers that had once followed Rowan and Mason through town had grown quieter. Time had not changed everyone, but kindness had changed enough. One afternoon, Rowan unlocked the old lakeside cabin with the brass key Grandpa had given him. The familiar scent of cedar and lake water greeted them as they stepped inside. Dust no longer covered the furniture. Fresh curtains hung beside the windows. The old rocking chair still faced the lake. Walter smiled as he looked around. You've taken good care of it. It deserves another chapter, Rowan replied. Walter nodded slowly. So did I. He walked to the window where he had once stood surrounded by painful memories. This time, his expression carried peace instead of regret. I used to think coming here would only remind me of what I'd lost. He turned toward Rowan and Mason. Now it reminds me of what was found. That evening, they shared dinner on the cabin porch while the sun slowly disappeared behind the lake. The conversation drifted from childhood memories to future dreams. Mason spoke about opening a small woodworking shop in town. Walter offered practical advice, though everyone suspected he simply wanted an excuse to visit often. Rowan listened to both of them with a quiet smile. Not long ago, he had believed happiness had to arrive all at once. Now he understood it arrived piece by piece. A shared meal. A patient conversation. A familiar laugh. A hand reaching for yours during a difficult day. Those moments became a life. As twilight settled over the lake, Walter reached into his jacket pocket. He removed one final letter. I found this tucked inside the journal. Rowan looked surprised. You hadn't read it? Walter shook his head. I wasn't ready. Carefully unfolding the paper, he smiled. It isn't long. He read aloud. If life ever leads you back to this lake, I hope you won't remember me with sadness. Remember me with gratitude. Love is never measured by how long it lasts. It's measured by how deeply it changes us. Walter folded the letter. For a moment, no one spoke. The words settled gently into the evening air. They were right, Mason said softly. Walter smiled. They usually were. On the drive back to the farmhouse, the sky filled with stars. The road ahead stretched peacefully through the countryside. Rowan looked out the window, thinking about the journey that had brought them there. He had arrived believing he needed to rebuild his life. Instead, he had discovered something far more valuable. He had found people willing to walk beside him while he rebuilt it himself. When they reached home, the porch light glowed warmly in the darkness. Walter paused before opening the front door. This house taught me something, he said. Rowan looked at him. What is it? Walter smiled. Love doesn't erase yesterday. It simply gives tomorrow a better place to begin. The three of them stepped inside together. The old clock continued its steady rhythm. The fireplace crackled softly. Laughter soon filled the kitchen as they prepared a late-night snack, talking about tomorrow's work as though tomorrow was a gift waiting to be opened. Outside, the farmhouse stood quietly beneath a sky full of stars. Inside, three lives once shaped by loneliness, fear, and regret had become a family strengthened by honesty, compassion, and hope. Some stories end with a single moment. Theirs did not. It continued in every sunrise they shared, every meal around the old wooden table, every repaired fence, every quiet conversation, and every choice to face the future together. Because home was never simply a place. Home was the people who chose, every single day, to remain by one another's side.